Again, analysis. This time Grigoriev 1922. It's wise to play, and as you can see, looking at the board, we already have a pair of corresponding squares. That will be the exactly squares where the king are placed now. So once white gets control of f4, we need to occupy f6. That's our first pair of corresponding squares in this endgame. To help us build up the puzzle of corresponding and the web of corresponding squares, we're gonna remove the kings from the table just for a few minutes. So if white goes on f4, we need to go on f6, and this is our first pair. How about if white will have his king on h4? Where should the black king position himself? Because we cannot allow white to have access on the fifth rank, and the corresponding square will be g6 in this case. King on f6 will allow king h5, and we simply lost. We cannot push the pawn, we will lose the pawn, and doesn't matter where we withdraw, we will face a defeat. So for king h5, king h4 for white, we must place the king on g6. There we have the second pair of corresponding squares. h4 to g6. Now, how about if white will go to g3? Because g3 will allow white to have access to both h4 and f4. What square on the black side will allow black king to have access to those two? And that will be g7. So if king goes to g3, we must take g7. So that will be the third pair. Alright, but let's go a bit further. Let's see if white will go to f3. f3 will allow white, yeah, so I'm going to use a different token now, because now we have these double squares. So I'm going to use the camel this time. If king goes to f3, will allow him access to g and g3 and f4. So you remember g3 is with g7 and f4 is with f6. So again, this time the g6 square is the corresponding square. So we see that g6 corresponds for both g3, for h4 and for f3 square. It does happen sometimes like that. Now, what if white goes to h3? h3 will give white access to h4 and g3. So g3 is with g7 and h4 is with g6. What square will that be? That must be the f square again. So f6 will correspond, so these two squares access and these two squares access. Yeah. So h3 gives access to those two, and f6 gives access to those two. Alright, so this is another pair of corresponding squares. How about now if white will step on g2 square? If the white king is on g2 square, we see he has access to 3 corresponding squares. And by the color of the tokens, we can see he has access to the blue token square, to the red token square, and to g3. If you remember, we hopefully didn't forget, but if you can scroll back, g3 is corresponding with g7. There's only one square in the black side that can give him access to those corresponding squares, and that will be the f7 square. Unfortunately for black, that is an illegal move because of the white pawn on e6. So now we find ourselves the solution. All white has to do is maneuver on the corresponding squares up to g2 and therefore win the endgame, because black will no longer have a good move available. He'll find himself in Zugzwang, and therefore he will lose the game. So I'm gonna keep the tokens on the table, go from the starting position to help us visualize. White goes to f3. It's the red token, yeah? Black has to go to g6. Now white goes to g3. Black has to go to g7. Because once black goes to h4, white goes to h4, black has to be able to take g6. Alright, now if black goes to h3, again, he has to be ready to reply h4 with g6, so that will be f6 for black. How about finally white going to g2 square? There's no more correspondent squares for black because f7 is forbidden. If black steps now on g6, yeah, white can step on f3, yeah. Then we know that g3 corresponds with this one, yeah. But let's say, okay, I'm not going to step on this one because he will go there. I'll go to f6. And we end up in the same position like initially with black to move. And now it doesn't matter what black will choose. He's losing your position, and he will therefore lose the game. So now black has to go to g6, and the final punch from white is pawn to e7. Black has to withdraw to f7. We take the black pawn. If white takes, we flank and therefore win the endgame.